to the Mad Wild West podcast. Kick your boots off and stay a while, because you're about to hear the stories lost in time from the people that lived and made the Wild West mad. It's that time again. Time to look at ads of the Mad Wild West times. We're visiting Prescott, Arizona, or Prescott, how they say it here in Arizona. The first ad has a picture of a metal bathtub, and it says, "Warm and cold at Montezuma Hall, Prescott. Shaving, haircutting, etc. in the most approved manner. Theodore Otto, owner." So if you've been out on the trails riding, make sure you go see Theodore Otto over at Montezuma Hall and get scrubbed behind the ears before you go out on the town and wash some of that Wild West dirt off you. So once you're all cleaned up, what does a good cowboy do? He goes to the bar. Here's an ad. Magnolia Brewery and Saloon in Wickenburg, Arizona. The undersigned respectfully informs the public and his old friends that he is now manufacturing and keeps constantly on hand a superior quality of lager beer. In connection with the brewery is a first-class bar, which is always supplied with the best liquors and cigars. The patronage of the public is solicited. A.H. Peoples, owner, Wickenburg, Arizona, March 12th, 1869. Get cleaned up and go have yourself a drink. Try not to get into too much trouble. And after a night of drinking and playing cards, just like they did every weekend in the Wild West, what do? You wander on over to the Arizona Hotel in Wickenburg. The undersigned, having recently taken charge of the above-named house, would inform people of Arizona and the traveling public that it is his intention to do everything possible to please and satisfy all who favor him with their patronage. In connection with the Arizona is a stable where animals will be fed and attended to. Major W. Montgomery, proprietor, Wickenburg, Arizona. There you can hang your hat for a night, get out of your drunken stupor, your horse is ready to go for the next morning, back out on the trails, exploring the Mad Wild West. It's time to take a look at the news of the day, coming from the Weekly Arizona Miner, August 28th, 1869. It reads, "Killed by Indians. Harrison Gray, a native of Kentucky, was, while working in a field at Walnut Grove on Wednesday, August 18th, set upon and brutally murdered by some 50 or 60 Indians. Before falling dead, the deceased ran about 50 yards toward the house of L.R. Stevenson's. While conveying the body of the murdered man to the house, the Indians shouted to Stevenson that his turn would come next. Never before have the Indians acted so badly as at present, and we implore the military authorities to send us more troops immediately, as the forces here at present is too small to protect so extensive a country as this. The cavalry companies, which we learn are but companies in name, should at least be filled up." Here's one you don't hear every day. An engine loose on the Pacific Railroad. At Echo on the Union Pacific Rail the other evening, 3 freight trains stood upon the main track when word came flashing over the telegraph from the superintendent. A locomotive and tender with steam up and nobody on board had broken loose from a freight train and started down the grade. Then and there was hurrying to and fro. In a few seconds came a second message. She had just passed Castle Rock Station. Then the workmen piled sleepers high on the track, lest even that should not stop her, and should do murder further down the road. So they tore up the rails below. Just as this was accomplished, she came into sight. She shot through the sleepers like a bullet through pine boards, sending them flying in all directions, and darkening the air with the splinters. But at that broken track, she jumped up and down with vexation and finally plunged angrily head foremost into the hillside. She ran 26 miles in 29 minutes, the best time on that route yet. The next headline reads, "Another victory over Indians." With unbounded satisfaction and great gladness of heart do we publish the fact that on the morning of Sunday, August 22nd, 1869, A party of 20 men, mostly Mexicans, surprised a large nest of Indians in the ranchera near the head of Antelope Creek, about 4 miles from Martinez Ranch and 8 or 10 from Camp Date Creek, killing, according to one account, 19 and to another 20. We have the facts from several persons, and though those statements regarding the number of Indians killed do not agree, we are satisfied that the Mexicans made a good haul. John Garner, mail rider between this place and Wickenburg, says that on the 21st the Indians were prowling around Weaver and shot the bell mare belonging to a Mexican pack train. As soon as dark came, the people met, and under the lead of Joaquin Barbre, took the trail of the Indians, which they with great difficulty followed to the head of Antelope Creek, where they discovered the ranchera, which they say contained about 140 huts and 250 or 300 Indians. The little force posted themselves at various points around the camp, and at 5 o'clock in the morning opened fire upon it, driving its occupants, who were not killed or wounded, into the rocks. The Mexicans then charged onto the ranchera and commenced destroying it, but had to abandon it almost immediately after entering it, as the Indians, upon seeing the small force that had driven them from their camp, charged back with great fury, and the little band was forced to retreat. In this onslaught, 3 of the men were wounded. One, a Frenchman, was shot through the arm. A Mexican, whose name we do not know, received 3 wounds. The party then started for Wickenburg, the people of which town testified their thankfulness for the gallant deed performed by the Mexicans, by raising and presenting them with a large sum of money. The Mexicans say that the ranchera were members of 4 different tribes of Indians: the Pinals, Apache Mojaves, and 2 river tribes. A pair of buckskin gloves marked H. Martin, Company E, 32nd Infantry, was found in the ranchera. All honor to the Mexicans for their daring, successful performance. And one final headline here from the news of the day. Headline reads, Arrival of General Wheaton. Major General Frank Wheaton arrived at Fort Whipple Saturday afternoon and took command of the post as well as the sub-district of Upper Arizona. Knowing that our people are anxious to learn something regarding the man upon whom the responsibility of protecting them from the Indian hordes that infest this portion of the territory rests, we call at the residence of Colonel E.D. Baker Sunday last, were introduced to the general, conversed with him upon many topics of interest in the territory, and came away with the firm belief that he will provide an able, efficient officer and a true friend to the territory. Not being possessed of the cheek of San Francisco local reporter, we did not, of course, undertake to bore the general with questions regarding his past services, but we have since learned from another officer that for bravery, skill, knowledge of Indian warfare, and gentlemanly traits of character, our new commander bears a high reputation in Army circles. He's an old frontiersman, having helped survey the boundary line between New and Old Mexico in 1855, when he passed down the Gila in this territory and spent many months in Arizona. He has fought Indians in Nebraska, Colorado, Idaho, Wyoming, Texas, and New Mexico. During the war, he had commanded the 6th Division of Sedgwick's Corps and took part in every important battle fought in Virginia. He came here direct from New Orleans, Louisiana. The general was accompanied by his wife, who we are informed is an intelligent woman. This is all we know about General Wheaton, and we will close by hoping that the authorities at Washington and San Francisco will render him all the aid in their power in efforts to put forth to subdue the Indians and give peace to this Indian-ridden land. There you go, folks. What was happening again back in 1869 in the Mad Wild West. Today, this episode was written in a book in 1872 about a man named James Hobbs. He was born in 1819. Not sure when he died, but it's his actual adventures as basically a borderman. He talks about his hunting and his trapping adventures with Kit Carson, captivity and life among the Comanches, and then his service in the war with Mexico. And then after the war, he talks about different adventures he had in business and just life in general. We're going to pick up at a spot in his life about a year after the Mexican-American War. And he has basically been doing work in Arizona, Mexico, and parts of California. So go ahead, hop off your horse, sit around the campfire, and get comfy. Dive into a segment of this man's life. So hold on to your hats. Here we go. After serving 4 months as a wagon master, Mr. Gleaning, being in want a foreman in the blasting department, requested me to superintend it for a short time, and for 2 months I endeavored to discharge that duty at the mine, though I did not like the dangerous business. It was part of my duty to measure the holes drilled by the men, which were to be 18 inches deep. One day, while employed, a Mexican laborer who had been carelessly admitted below while drunk was sitting down with a lot of loose powder in an open handkerchief on the ground between his legs. He began to smoke a cigarette and drop fire into the powder, which, in its explosion, threw him against the rocks, dashing his brains out. A flat stone struck me in the side and knocked me close to a shaft 50 feet deep. A foot or two further, and I should have lost my life. I did not consider this a healthy business, and gave up my position, excusing myself on the ground of exceeding dampness below affecting my health. I then took charge of the wagons again. The 4th day after renewing my trips, I was about a half mile from the mine with my teams when the company magazine of 500 kegs of blasting powder, some 300 yards from the mine and in the edge of town, blew up. It shattered the building over the mine, shook the hill, and down deep in the mine flung rocks upon miners from the roofs of their drifts, killing many. Others working in spurts at a distance from the ventilation shafts were suffocated. Altogether, 85 miners perished, and about 65 or 70 others were killed outside. The magazine was strongly built of stone and cement, but nothing remained of it except the foundation. As I felt the explosion and looked back, the smoke was bursting up like a great white cloud, in the midst of which were flying rocks. Near to me fell a human arm, probably one of the guards, as it had the cuff of a soldier's coat on it. Bottles and fragments of goods from a grocer's stand near the magazine flew past our heads. As soldiers constantly stood on guard and prohibited smoking within 150 yards of the grounds, the cause of the explosion was and is a mystery. The year was about 1850. I was making my way up to where 2 rivers, which were about 20 miles apart and running nearly parallel. It was on the headwaters of this river and among the mountains on the boundary between the Sonora and Chihuahua that we had a famous fight several years before with the Apaches when we destroyed one of their villages. To the wonderful rich country in that vicinity of that beautiful lake I have spoken in a former chapter. It is possible that Brigham Young may move the Mormons if they should find Utah too civilized for them and to be compelled to leave for some more favored region. A particular incident of cholera occurred. The people were dying so rapidly that there was no time for digging graves. Trenches were dug, the dead were carried to them in wagons and carts, thrown and covered with quicklime. One driver took a load of the bodies out of town, and among them was an old acquaintance of his, whom he tumbled into the trench with the rest and threw on the lime. While he had gone back to town for more bodies, this acquaintance, who was in a stupor, recovered consciousness and started on his way back to town. When the driver, who had now filled his cart and was on his way to the trench, arrived within about 100 yards of his destination, he came suddenly upon his ghostly friend, his supposed dead acquaintance. And he was so badly frightened that he jumped from his cart, left it in the road, ran back to town in all haste, took cholera himself, and died the next day. I have often since that time seen old Jim, the supposed corpse, peddling candy in the streets of the town. About 75 miles further north, I arrived at another town. In that vicinity, I got acquainted with a tribe of Indians I'd never seen or heard of before, called Saris. They were formerly very hostile toward the Mexicans, and were a lazy group living principally on the coast and feeding mainly on sea lions, porpoises, sharks, and different kinds of fish. When they were at war with the Mexicans, they used poison arrows, so virulent that whenever one of them broke the skin, it was certain death. Their mode of poisoning their arrows was to get a liver of a shark or some animal and let a rattlesnake bite it several times. Then, leaving it in the sun till it became perfectly green, they would stick the points of the arrows into it, soaking them in the deadly poison till they were thoroughly infected. At a town called Altar, near the northern boundary line of Sonora, we engaged 20 vaqueros, or Mexican herdsmen. We also purchased a lot of jackasses to use in place of pack mules, 8 of which I required for my use and for my men. A number of Mexican men, women, and children who were poor people going to California joined our company for their protection. We had a guide, a Mexican who had come over the road from California, with the 3 other owners of stock. A part of our route lay through a sandy country destitute of rivers or springs. On the route is a great rock with a cavity which is so large that in the rainy season fills up and supplies water for travelers year-round. It was 160 or 170 miles from Altar and 8 miles from our last watering place. We could drink at the rock ourselves and bring water enough for our mules, horses, and jacks. But our cattle had to go dry, and before us was a stretch of 60 miles of sandy desert without a drop of water that we knew of, or a blade of grass. The desert was so subject to sandstorms, which blew the fine sand up in clouds like a fog and swept it over the road, obliterating all tracks and making traveling by compass necessary. We had no fears of our jacks, for they can forage for a living. A bundle of rags or a deck of cards is a fine lunch for one of them. The morning after leaving the watering place, there was a great complaint on account of the scarcity of hats. The jacks had been around and eaten up 10 of the Mexican broad-brimmed straw hats, besides a lot of our bread. While the Mexicans were lamenting the loss of their hats, I discovered a greater loss. I missed 2 of my jacks, and while trying to track them, I saw moccasin tracks of 2 Indians. Taking a Mexican along with me, we rode about 4 miles, tracking the Indians easily. And then, on seeing a smoke among the hills, we dismounted and, creeping around, saw one of the Apaches roasting a steak which he had cut from one of my jacks which he had killed. The other Indian had started for a stream of water close by. I told the Mexican to attend to this one, while I crawled up near the Indian by the fire and shot him in the back. He fell forward on his face into the fire with his jackass meat. The other one escaped from the Mexican, but we secured the stolen jack that remained and returned to camp, glad indeed to find water for our stock. On reflection, I felt sorry that I had shot the Indian, as his theft led me to discover water sufficient to save many of our animals who were suffering. We sent back and picked up 50 or 60 cattle that had given out by the way, got them up there and joined the herd when they were all safely driven to the stream of water. We remained there 2 days resting the stock and then started for Fort Yuma on the Colorado River. We arrived there the 2nd day after leaving the stream that saved our stock. Upon arriving at the Colorado River, we found that the Indians had improvised a ferry boat by making a government wagon body watertight, and we crossed in this boat 6 miles below the fort, swimming our animals over. At Fort Yuma, I met a very large Irish woman called the Great Western, whom I had seen at Sausalito when I went there with Colonel Doniphan. She was noted as a camp follower in the Mexican War, was liked universally for her kind motherly ways, and at the Battle of Buena Vista busied herself in making cartridges for the army. I made myself known to her, and she was very glad to see me. She complained that Fort Yuma was the hardest place to procure any fresh supplies that she had ever seen, and begged me to sell her a beef. I sent her one as a present. She died at Fort Yuma in 1863. From Fort Yuma, we started again, going by the way of New River and having to pass through a desert of sand 60 miles across, with water only at one place, and that small pool hardly fit to drink. In passing through this desert, we came upon the remains of an immigrant train, which a month previous had attempted to cross this desert in going from the United States to California. While passing over the desert, they had been met by a sandstorm and lost the road by the sand blowing over it, and had wandered off into the hills. They had finally got back onto the road, but by that time they were worn out and they perished of fatigue and thirst. In their wanderings off the road, they had gone to one side and passed a little pool of water, as we could see by the wagons they had abandoned. The missing of the water was fatal to them, as they had been 2 or 3 days without water and yet 30 miles to go before reaching a fertile region. We could see where they had lightened their loads by abandoning goods, but still their cattle had been obliged to yield to the terrible thirst. There were 8 women and children and 9 men. The body of a child had been almost stripped of flesh by the buzzards and animals, and its clothes were torn off. But most of the other bodies had their clothes on. Some of the bodies were in the road and others a little distance, as if they had been returning to the road, and they had all sunk down together exhausted and lay there in the same position as when they fell. A squad of soldiers from Fort Yuma overtook us at the pool on their way to bury these unfortunate people, and we left them at their work, for we had to hasten onward as our cattle were now suffering badly. The soldiers said they should take the property of these immigrants back to the fort and institute proper inquiries to ascertain who were the relatives and friends in the East, with what success I had never learned. We traveled that day and night, and the next afternoon we arrived at a small lake at the head of New River. The next morning a difficulty arose between Dave Brown, who was one of our stock owners, and one of the Mexicans. The result was that Dave shot and killed the Mexican. We buried the poor man and blamed Mr. Brown very much, for he had no justifiable reason for the deed. The Mexican herdsman felt quite aggravated by the affair and asked me what could be done, but I persuaded them to wait until we arrived in California before making any trouble about it. The next water was 12 miles from this lake. Before reaching it, we met a Mexican who warned us to be sure to keep our stock out of that water, or we would lose all of them, as the water was very poisonous. A weed grows in the edges, and any animal eating it dies. The poison mainly comes from mineral matter, for there are green, filthy springs dripping into it, probably charged with copperas. Along the edges of this creek were hundreds of skeletons of sheep which had perished out of a large drove that were passing over this route some time before, bound for California. A little above the creek and to the right of the road, we found a spring of good water, of which we drank and gave to our riding and pack animals, but there was none for our cattle. 12 miles further on, we came to a valley with many springs and fine grass for our cattle. We found an American there putting up a station. We also found a dirty lot of Indians called diggers, who sleep in the dirt like hogs and live on rabbits, rats, lizards, toads, snakes, and any other animal food they could get, besides eating a black, bitter kind of acorn. 4 days after, we arrived in San Diego County, 18 miles from the port of San Diego, where we stayed a month resting our stock, and in the meantime I went down the port to purchase supplies. After resting our stock, we went 170 miles up the coast to El Monte, which was in Los Angeles County. The buildings of this place looked very ancient, and the inhabitants were ignorant and vicious, caring for neither law or gospel. At El Monte, I separated my stock from that of Messrs. Brown, Smith, and Akram. This Dave Brown, being a regular desperado, went 8 miles to Los Angeles, gambled off all his stock, got into a dispute with a Mexican over a game of cards, and shot him. He was put into jail by the Americans, partly through fear of being assassinated. In the night, a large body of Mexicans gathered, took Brown from the jail, and hung him on the top of the gateway of the prison yard. There were in Los Angeles about equal number of Americans and Mexicans. Lynch law was prevalent over California at this time, 1851, and the Americans made no objection to the hanging of Brown because they knew it was just. Shortly after, I drew out enough to pay off my help who had come through with my cattle, and they proposed to start on an expedition with me to the mountains to dig gold. I finally organized a party of 18 persons, fitted up a pack mule train with pans, picks, shovels, and all necessary outfits for gold digging, and started for a reported rich placer diggings at Camp Sonora, 150 miles southeast of San Francisco. We put up our tents and commenced prospecting around the gulches. In the vicinity were many Chinamen, Americans, Spaniards, Frenchmen, and Mexicans. Some of our party told me they had found a gulch nearby which paid 8 or 10 cents to the pan, and upon examination I found it to be so. We immediately moved our tents up there and went to work taking out about $6,000 the first 8 days. My party being all Mexicans, a little incident now occurred which raised me very materially in their estimation. Suddenly, 2 Americans rode up to our camp, and one of them could speak a little Spanish. Stated that he had orders from the government to collect a tax of $20 from every Mexican and Chinaman found working at the mine. He had orders from the government to collect a tax of $20 from every Mexican and Chinaman found at work mining. I asked him in Spanish where his documents were that gave him this authority. He said his word was sufficient. I drew up my double-barrel shotgun and said, "Now you leave here or I'll give you documents. I've heard of your kind before." They rode away, threatening to come back and collect the tax. I told the Mexicans to keep their arms handy by them and to do just as I bade them. Then I went to a mining justice of the peace not far off and asked him if there were any persons about there with authority to collect such tax. He said there were not, but he had heard of those men and would like to get a hold of them. I said, "They're out there behind your house drinking in a grocer." He said he would like to arrest them if he could get anybody to sustain him. I replied that I had 18 Mexicans and that I would sustain him. Then going down to my Mexicans, who were afraid for their lives, I said to them, "You have put yourselves under my charge, and I will see you safe through everything." There were 9 Americans just below who joined us. We went up to the grocer, and as we came near, saw the justice, who waved his hand for us to go around the house. We surrounded it, when one of the men ran out of the house, pistol in hand, and was instantly shot and killed. The other gave himself up, telling us that his name was Jack Downing. We put a rope around his neck and hung him to the limb of a tree that stood by the grocer. Before being swung off, he was asked if he had anything to say, and his only reply were curses. It was afterwards ascertained that he and his companions had a few days before murdered 2 Chinamen and a Mexican. The 2 men had $4,000, which they had collected and robbed from ignorant miners. This money was deposited with the Justice of Peace to pay the expenses of a mining government, which we at once set about organizing for our mutual benefit and protection. I next went to see the famous Quicksilver Mine, 12 miles south of San Jose, and the Soda Spring, which is a curiosity that attracts many visitors. The water boils up precisely like soda, and it is taken in bottles to San Jose for drinking. The day I returned to San Jose, water was struck in an artesian well 450 feet deep and 10 inches in diameter. The water came up with such a force that if a man laid a board over the mouth and stood on it, it would raise him up a foot. 4 blind fish, 2 or 3 inches long, were thrown out, but died immediately. At first a great deal of sand came up, but the water soon cleared, and San Jose is now supplied water from this well. Other artesian wells were opened about this time, and a month later the waters of a certain lake 6 miles long and 4 miles across and 15 or 20 feet in depth began to dry up. The lake was situated 35 miles from San Jose, and in 6 weeks had become perfectly dry, leaving a quantity of dead fish in the bottom. In the bed of the lake was seen a huge rupture or crack that might have been produced by an earthquake at some prior period. There is now a good farm highly cultivated where the lake was. One of the many things I loved to do was duck hunt, and one time between sundown and dark we halted and camped in the edge of some bushy scrub oak on a hillside. While we were at supper, Theodore Boggs' horse broke the brush to which he was tied, and he took him up a hill a short distance to secure him to a larger sapling. Presently we heard a fearful shriek and the growling of a bear and knew that Boggs was in trouble. We all started for his relief and found a large bear had him down. It was now so dark as to render it unsafe to shoot at the bear, so I attacked him with my knife and succeeded in killing him. We found poor Boggs horribly mutilated, his face being bitten all to pieces and his side torn open. He was senseless when we took him up, but by the time a carriage for which we had sent 10 miles arrived, which was about daylight, he was able to talk. He was aware that he could not live, but expressed a strong desire to reach home before he died. We reached home the next day, and our friend died soon after. His frightful death was a severe blow to his 2 brothers who were in the party. Before the carriage arrived, some of us went to look at the bear and found her mate and 2 cubs by her side. The old bear was killed and the cubs captured and taken home. Thus sorrowfully ended our excursion, which had promised so much pleasure. In the early part of 1854, I had an invitation from Colonel James and the Commissioner, Colonel Thompson, to meet at the City Hall in San Francisco as they were about to transact important business. I attended and found a hall full of laborers, merchants, mechanics, and other honest men who had met as a vigilance committee to take active measures to put down gambling and thieving. The meeting was secret, no one being allowed there except honest men engaged in some reputable calling. This was on Monday night, and after perfecting our arrangements, Wednesday morning was fixed upon for a raid on the gamblers and thieves, on which day no business was to be done, and the stores would be closed throughout the city. A few days before the organization of the committee, the editor of the daily paper called the Town Talk had published an article which reflected severely on the gamblers and cutthroats of the city, and the next morning, as the editor, Mr. King, was crossing the street, he was shot down by a desperado named Buckley. Wednesday morning, the Vigilance Committee paid a visit to this Buckley, who was a notorious bully and dared anybody to arrest him. We found him asleep and gave him no time for repentance. But the brother of the murdered editor put the rope around his neck, and we hung him from his own bedroom window in the upper story, leaving him to the gaze of thousands in the street below. He was the first man hung by this committee. I spent much time in the Arizona Territory. In the Arizona Territory has many gold and silver mines. Indians have sometimes used these metals for making bullets before they knew the worth of coin. I was an eyewitness when the same surgeon who operated on me cut a gold bullet from a Mexican who had been shot with it by an Apache. The bullet weighed a half ounce. A short time after the murder of Major Val's children, a Mexican woman made her escape from the Apaches. She had been a prisoner among them for 14 years, and she reported that there were large quantities of gold in the mountains where the Apaches lived. She showed some specimens of gold which she brought, weighing in from 1 to 3 ounces. Some persons then employed her as a guide to these mountains. She told them it was a dangerous expedition, as the Apaches were a much stronger tribe than they were aware of. A large party of about 600 were gathered, however, from the vicinity of the fort to go gold hunting, and this woman accompanied them as a guide. After several days' travel, as they were proceeding through a narrow pass, she and 6 soldiers were shot dead by the Apaches, who were concealed among the rocks. The Indians showed themselves then in such great number that the party of gold seekers were compelled to retreat and leave their dead. They returned to Tubac and reported that the Indians were so numerous that it was impossible to proceed to the mountains. There was an understanding between the governor of Sonora and the commander of the United States at these Arizona forts to work in harmony whenever the Apaches made a combined attack either on the Sonora side or the Arizona side, as by union they could better repel the Indians. Soon after the return of the gold seekers, a body of Apaches made their appearance in Sonora, committing many depredations and capturing women and children. The governor of Sonora sent dispatches to the commander of the United States troops in Arizona, appealing for him for aid, and troops were sent to his assistance immediately. As the Sonoran troops were advancing from the west and ours proceeding to meet them, the Indians were caught between the two parties, and about 80 of them were killed and a number taken prisoner, among them a brother of the Apache chief named Cachis. A dozen or more Mexican women and children that the Indians had in captivity were released. Cachis and the other Indians, it was decided to hang at once. Cachis was singing just before we hung him, when he stopped and cried out in Spanish, "Why do you not take a knife or a lance and kill us like men and not hang us like dogs?" Cachis was the last man hung, and when they were ready to place the rope about his neck, he caught the man who was adjusting the rope with his teeth, tearing off part of his sleeve, when he was struck on the head by a soldier and rendered senseless, and was immediately hung. One Indian boy captured with them was saved by the interference of Lieutenant Williams. He took him to Apache Pass in Arizona, where he kept him for 4 or 5 months. The lieutenant gave him a gun and ammunition, as he was in the habit of going out hunting deer, etc., and furnishing the lieutenant with game. One day the lieutenant rode a fine saddle mule out to a spring about 2 miles from the fort, as was his usual custom for exercise. This young Apache was concealed behind a tree about 20 steps from the road and attempted to shoot the lieutenant as he passed, but the gun misfired. Lieutenant Williams rushed upon the Indian and, drawing his pistol, forced the young Indian to surrender the gun. He pleaded for his life, and the lieutenant bound his hands with a rope and made him walk ahead to the fort. Williams was very angry and yet very curious to know the object of the Indian boy in trying to kill him, who had been his benefactor. But when he found that he had no motive at all, he strung him up to a post in a hurry, saying that was the last Indian he would ever place confidence in. About this time, an immigrant train on its way from Texas through this section had arrived at a place called Tulare Flats, when they were attacked by Apache Indians, who laid an ambush on each side of the road, each Indian being disguised by having sagebrush tied to his head. This immigrant train numbered about 50 men, women, and children. The Indians kept quiet till the train had arrived abreast of them, when they all arose at once, and with tremendous yells frightened the teams so that they soon ran in greatest panic. They fired into the whites, killing all the men but 2 who made their way and escape to Tucson. The officers at Fort Tucson sent a party in pursuit of the Indians, who, on arriving at the place which the train had been surprised, witnessed a horrible spectacle. Men, women, and children, most of whom were scalped, lay there with their brains beaten out, and about them were the remnants of their wagons which had been burned. One woman, Miss Mary Holiday, was found still alive with 6 arrows sticking in her breast, and near her were the dead bodies of her 2 children. She was unable to speak, and her signs were scarcely intelligible. Wagons were sent to take this unfortunate woman, the bodies of those who were killed, and what remained of their effects to the fort, where the dead received proper burial. Miss Holiday lived but a short time after arrival at the fort. Near the scene of the fight, the bodies of 5 Apache Indians were found, secreted in a bush. The 2 men who escaped gave us an account of the fight and reported that 4 girls were missing from the party and could not be found, and we concluded the Indians had run them off into captivity. Some 2 months after this, one of the girls made her appearance at Fort Buchanan, when she reported that 2 of the girls were dead from the violence and outrage of the Indians, and so far as she knew, the other one was still living among them. This unfortunate girl was named Emma Brown, and she was in pitiful condition when she came to Fort Buchanan, barefoot and nearly destitute of clothing. She gave the following account of her escape from her captors. 2 days before, while on the hills with a band of Indians, she saw Fort Buchanan in the distance and resolved to make a desperate attempt to reach it. A favorable opportunity soon occurred. The chief who had her in charge had just returned from a thieving raid of several days and was very much exhausted. The whole band, feeling perfectly safe, had fallen asleep, and the chief, reclining with his head in her lap, was soon sound asleep. Carefully freeing herself from the Indian, she cast a hurried glance around her, and seeing the way clear, started off on her perilous journey for the fort she had seen in the morning, determined to reach it or perish in the attempt, as she felt death to be far preferable than the life she had led for the past 2 months. She took the direction of the fort and traveled all night in the mountains. In the morning she discovered below her a party of Indians following her. She was at this point in time following an Indian trail where she had been before, but immediately stepped to one side and secreted herself among the rocks. The Indians passed within a short distance of her, for she could distinguish their voices easily. They did not look for her trail, as they seemed to take it for granted she would follow the Indian trail she was in, and they hurried on in the direction she had been going. Here she had dreaded an encounter with some wild beast, for the place was wild and rough, but she preferred death in that form rather than recapture. In a short time, she discovered the Indians, about 50 in number, returning, coming to the place in the trail where she had left it. They dismounted from the horses and searched in all directions, and in doing so, passed around the rocks where she had first secreted herself. From here, she had been very careful to walk on stones or rocks to her present hiding place, and they were unable to track her. She remained in her hiding place until the Indians had left and gone back to their camp. Then, with desperate energy, she resumed her flight towards the fort, where she arrived utterly exhausted, as she had been 2 days on her weary march without food or sleep. Her feet were bound up with pieces of the last skirt she had, for the Indians had kept her barefoot for the fear she might escape. Her clothing consisted simply of well-worn and rags from contact with the brush she had passed along the way. Her way to the fort had been through a country abounding in prickly pear bushes, which had destroyed her clothing, and her feet were so filled with the thorns that it was some days before they were all removed. She was taken in charge by the wife of Major Wells at the fort, and was confined to her bed in care of the physician for more than a month before she recovered. During this she was often delirious, shrieking in her agony, "They have killed my father, my mother, and my 2 sisters. Don't let them kill me." It was true that her parents and sisters were killed in the massacre, and she was left alone in the world. When she had regained her health, she was sent by the officers at the fort, who supplied her with clothing and money, to San Francisco, and from there to Galveston, Texas, where she had an uncle, the only relative she had living. The conclusion. In the foregoing pages, I have endeavored to give an account of a portion of my adventures in a life of more than unusual peril and excitement. I was induced to publish this account by the earnest recommendation of many friends. It has been written out as I have had time, entirely from my memory, as I never kept a diary of the events, never thinking that I should publish my experiences. In looking back over my life, I find that although I have not perhaps always obeyed the golden rule, yet it is a great satisfaction to me to think of the numbers of my fellow beings I have been instrumental in saving from death and misery at the hands of many people, and from the horrors of starvation. And now that my labors in this direction are completed, I shall probably retire to my California home and devote myself to stock raising. Hoping that this narrative may prove of interest to the reader, I will say goodbye. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode and the crazy stories. And until the next episode, keep your horses tied up. Thanks for listening. The Mad Wild West Podcast. These are the true